Okay, for our first exercise, we are going to just be drawing this very simple solid. If I rotate it around here, you can see it's pretty basic. It's just a simple 2D sketch that's been extruded into 3 dimensions to give it, to create a solid form. In order to really examine what we have, we're going to have to take a look at the sketch to reveal the dimensions that we have to work with. The dimensions that were given for this particular sketch are a length of 100 millimeters on the bottom, a height of 35 millimeters, a distance of 60 millimeters, and 2 angle dimensions, one of 100 and one of 135. These dimensions are going to be the things that help us make up our drawing. So with that information in mind, we're going to go ahead and start this drawing. So my recommendation here is to kind of watch how I build this from the beginning. I'm going to talk you through it. I would watch the video first and then absolutely go back and try it. SolidWorks, like anything else, is something you learn best by doing. And I think it's a little bit confusing to kind of try to follow along as I sketch and do the extrusion. So it's probably better to watch it through first and then go back and repeat the exercise on your own. Everything in SolidWorks starts with what's called a sketch, and the sketch part is really designed to be just that, a sketch. If you have any experience drawing with other drawing programs, AutoCAD being kind of first and foremost in my mind anyway, you might start a line and then you'd give that line a specific length or a specific angle, draw another line, give that line a specific length or a specific angle. In SolidWorks, the intent here is to kind of capture your base geometry as quickly as possible without being, spending a lot of time being super accurate, if you will. So we're going to start by clicking on the Sketch tab, and that changes our tool ribbon to the Sketch ribbon. And we're going to start by creating a new sketch. So to do that, you actually have to initiate the sketch by clicking the Sketch button, which is the one here in the top left. Once you do that, the first thing you'll see is the default planes show up here. And as you move your mouse through the workspace, you'll see those different planes start to highlight. The first exercise we're doing, you want to think about how you want others to perceive that object. So all of the dimensions we're given for that first drawing are all what I would consider the front view of that object. And so we're going to want to choose the front plane as the plane that we're going to draw on. So I'm going to move and highlight until that front plane is highlighted orange, and then simply click. What SolidWorks then does is it makes that plane what's called normal to your surface. So what you see on your monitor is existing only on that front plane. Even if there's things that are in parallel planes behind it, everything you draw on now that you've selected that plane will be on the front plane. This is a very basic geometry that's really just made up of 5 lines. So to do that, we're going to select the line tool here in the top left corner. So I choose line, and I'm going to come down here, and I'm actually going to choose the origin point as the start point of my object. In SolidWorks, to be fully defined, an object has to have some relationship to the origin. If you're doing just a simple part like the one I'm doing, simply starting that sketch on the origin is probably good enough. As you build out more complex parts, oftentimes you may want things centered around the origin, or if you're building assemblies, it's oftentimes helpful to have a kind of common origin location. But in this case, the simplest way to start is just to start using the origin as our start point. So once I've selected that line tool, I'm going to bring my the pencil now over to that origin point and click, and I'm going to start to pull out to the right. You'll see just to the bottom right of my pencil, there's a little yellow box with a horizontal line through it. That is called a relationship. If you pull your pencil away from that horizontal or vertical, you'll notice that that relationship disappears. But in this case, I want that bottom line to be horizontal. So I'm going to make sure that I see that horizontal relation indicated before I click. Otherwise, I'm not really concerned at all about the length here. just more so that it is in fact horizontal. If you miss that by accident, we can always add that in afterwards, but you know, it's pretty easy to sketch and make sure you pull that line horizontally. Once you have that first line pulled out, click, and I'm going to pull up a ways here, and I'm again looking now for the vertical constraint. So you'll see that indicated in that yellow box just to the lower right corner of the pencil eraser of my pencil icon there. So you'll see yellow box with the vertical line indicating that that line is vertical. I click to place that vertical line. Now I'm going to start an elevated line. So I want that line to come up some degree. Again, I'm not worried about the angle necessarily. What I don't want is to make it snap to the midpoint here. So you'll see as I pull it close to the midpoint, it's giving me that dotted blue line showing me the extension of that midpoint. I don't want that to be the case. So I'm going to pull a little bit to the way, a little bit away from that midpoint location and click. Now I want a slight downward tilt. And again, you'll see it starts to track over to itself. We don't want that tracking from the right side, but we do want the tracking from the bottom. So watch as I get close to that bottom line, you'll see that blue dotted line come up. And now you'll notice beneath my pencil, or to the right of my pencil, instead of a yellow box, I have a white box. And what that white box is saying is that if I click, the white box is referring actually to that blue dotted line. So if I click here, that blue dotted line will be vertical to my origin point. And that's exactly what I want, because I want this to be perpendicular to my start line. So once I see that, I can go ahead and click, and I'm going to pull that line back down to the origin point to finish that box. Once I do that, you'll immediately notice that the inside of that box turns gray, and that lets me know that I have completed a solid. It's a complete sketch that doesn't have any openings inside of it. What that means is I would be able to extrude this box. SolidWorks is a mechanical engineering design program, and as such, typically when we're drawing things in SolidWorks, we want to make sure they are very specifically the precise geometry that we want. So at this stage, I could absolutely exit the sketch and extrude this, but what I really want to do is I want to give SolidWorks some parameters by which it understands exactly what the geometry needs to be here. SolidWorks is known as a parametric modeler, so that term parameters is an important part of that modeling, the modeling process. So right now, I do have some parameters here. I have our relationships, right? So I have this relationship of this vertical line here to this vertical line. I have the horizontal line for the horizontal line and another vertical line here. You'll also see this is a coincident relationship between the start point of my line and the origin point. At this point, I need to start to add a few other parameters. Those, in this case, are going to be in the form of dimensions. So to use the dimensions, I have to go up and choose the Smart Dimension tool, which is up here in the top left corner. I click on the Smart Dimension tool, and you'll notice that the icon has changed from a pencil to a dimension line. And the Smart Dimension tool is actually pretty smart. What this allows me to do is to go in, and it's going to start to respond to how I click. So the simplest form of Smart Dimension is just a length dimension. And to get that, I'm going to choose this bottom line. I'm not going to choose the midpoint, which shows up there. I'm going to make sure that I choose somewhere away from the midpoint. Other than that, you don't have to be really specific. So I want to define the length of this line. So I simply click on it. I'm going to pull down. So I click and let go. So it's when I say click, I don't mean click and hold, by the way. I'm going to click and let go. I'm going to pull down, and I'm going to place my dimension. And so this largely is a visual thing. As much as possible, I try to center my dimensions because it's much easier, I think, to see dimensions when they're centered on the object you're dimensioning. So I'm going to kind of position this in the center of my location, click to position that dimension, and then a little window pops up. Here I can simply type in the numeric value of the distance that I'm trying to create. In this case, it's 100. And I don't need to type millimeters because I've already defined the unit as millimeters, so I can simply type 100 and hit enter. and it's going to create that that line to be 100 units. You'll notice actually visually very little, if anything, changed on my object, because that first dimension is really creating the overall proportion of that object. Now, as I add additional dimensions, you'll see the geometry start to react. So the next dimension I'm going to add is this one on the left-hand side. So I'm going to come over to the left-hand edge, click, pull away. Again, position that dimension kind of up and down. I don't want it too far away from my object. I want it pretty tight, but I also don't want it like overlapping the line, because it's oftentimes hard to read those dimensions. So I'm going to pull this out and away, click, and this is going to have a dimension of 35 units. So I simply type in 35. And you'll notice that my line extended just a little bit at this stage. Now I'm ready to go ahead and do the dimension here across the top. Now this is a little nuanced, so just watch this closely. Here, just like before, I'm going to select the line, but as I pull away, you'll see this is giving me the distance of that line. It's giving me some information, 66.95. As you sketch this, you may or may not have that same dimension. But if I pull my mouse up and to the right, you'll notice immediately now it's giving me the X displacement dimension. And similarly, if I pull down and to the left, it's giving me the Y displacement dimension. So in this particular case, I don't want the distance. I don't want the distance of, or the length of that line. I actually want the X displacement value. So I'm going to position this over here. I'm going to click on that to position it, place it, and I'm going to type in 60 for the number for that X displacement. So we've got all of those guys going on here, and now we're ready to go ahead and add the angle dimension. So like I said, it's a smart dimension tool. So here, the dimension tool is still active. I'm going to come over to that left-hand line and click, and this is going to start to want to repeat that distance dimension. We already have that, so we obviously don't need that again. Without clicking a second time, I'm going to come up here and hover over this top left line and click. And as I do that, SolidWorks automatically switches to understand that you want to create an angle dimension between those two. So similarly with the distance dimensions, I'm going to move this out to position it. I'm going to click when I have a proper location. And if you remember from our example, this is 100 degrees. And there's one more dimension here that I need, but right now I'm gonna take a pause just to explain something to you. I'm gonna hit the escape key to get out of the dimension tool. So you'll notice that this is no longer gray up here, and I just have simply a mouse cursor, mouse pointer as my pointer icon. You'll notice as we've done this that lines have started to turn black. In SolidWorks, your goal is to turn all lines and all of the points black. That means that that line and that point are fully defined. If you have any blue lines or blue points, it means those are underdefined. So in this case, now that I don't have anything selected, you can start to try to figure out like, oh, what dimension am I missing here that I need to kind of reference in order to get an exact solid? So with this particular line, you can work through that very easily by simply hovering over the line till it turns orange and then clicking and holding on that line. And if I do that, I'm trying to move my mouse left and right and nothing's happening. So I know that I can't move that line specifically. If I hit escape again, I go back to that kind of neutral state, and I'll notice that there's a blue point. So let me come over to that blue point, wait for that to turn orange. I'm going to click and hold this time, and I'm going to start to move that. And you'll notice that now I can actually manipulate that geometry. I can't pull it left or right, but it will go up and down. And so for me, that's an easy realization that either I need to give it a dimension for the height of this, or the length of this, or the angle here. And again, if you're going back to that first exercise I showed you, the result here is the proper answer for this particular example is we want to create a dimension between these two lines, one of those an angle dimension. So I'm going to come back up here to my Smart Dimension tool, hover over the top left line, click, hover over the top right line, click, position my dimension so it's somewhere that makes sense, and this wants to be 135 degrees. Once I do that, I hit escape to get out of the dimension tool, and I'm just going to look. Everything is black. All the points are black. All the lines are black. The other thing, if you look down here at the bottom right corner, you'll see that it now says fully defined. If you look back, it said underdefined up until the point that I placed that dimension. So now that it's fully defined, there's nothing else I can do to that. In fact, if I go back to my Smart Dimension tool and I want to say like apply a dimension to this edge, I can position that dimension. That's a really weird number, by the way. And if I try to click to place that dimension, this window will pop up. And what it's saying is, adding this dimension, it's gonna over define the sketch, which means there's two things now fighting with one another. In this case, the length of this line is fighting with that 135 degrees, and it's asking, do you want to make this dimension driven or leave this dimension driving? So if you make this dimension driven, and I click OK, what it's going to do is you can't change that. It's going to be driven by any changes that you make other places. Whereas if I had made this the driving dimension, it's going to now change this 135 as that gets modified. So one of them has to be responsible or in charge, and the other one's going to be affected by it. So in this case, I'm over constraining it by adding that dimension. So I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to hit escape. It's telling me the value can't be changed. That's okay. I'm just going to hit the delete key to get rid of it. And again, I'm left with a fully defined sketch. Once you have a fully defined sketch, there's a really important next step, and that is to exit the sketch. So oftentimes I see people have some issues with sketches they're doing or parts they're drawing, and they're moving on to the next step without having exited the sketch. You need to exit the sketch to tell SolidWorks you're done messing around in the 2D space and you're ready to move on in the 3D space. So there's two ways of exiting the sketch. The first way is in the top right corner here. You have this little arrow with this blue line next to it. That's a very fast way to exit the sketch. Do be careful though when you're over here. If you hit the red X, that closes the drawing space without saving any of your changes. So it would revert back to the previous version. In that case, I'll lose all my work, right? It typically does warn you before that, saying, are you sure you want to do that? It's not going to save any of your work. But this is a very, very quick way to exit the sketch. The other way to exit the sketch is in the top left corner where we initiated the sketch. The minute we initiate the sketch, that button changes from sketch to exit sketch. And so we're going to go ahead and click that to exit the sketch. Once we do that, our object here looks like it's now turned back blue, but in fact, that's just because it is highlighted. And you can see it's highlighted over here. We now have a new addition to our design history saying sketch 1. And I need to give that sketch some dimension, I want to extrude that sketch to give it thickness. So we've been in the sketch tab. I'm going to click over to the features tab, which is just to the left of it. And the most basic of these is the extrude boss base. So I'm going to click on extrude boss base, and you'll see the screen will change to an isometric view so you can see what's going on. You could go ahead and click the arrow and you can kind of dynamically change this if you wanted to. It's giving you feedback of what the distance is. You could absolutely do that. Or probably the more accurate way to do this, if you want real dimensions, is to drive that whole operation using the interface screen on the left. This has replaced your design history here. And so I just want to work through this so you know kind of the options that you have. So right now it's saying from, meaning where is it extruding from, and the default is sketch plane. You could extrude from a surface or from a vertex or something like that. We don't have any of that other stuff existing, so sketch plane is the proper answer. Under direction 1, just to the left here, this actually changes which way it will extrude. And you'll see this pop up in a lot of different menus in SolidWorks. So right now it's extruding from my sketch plane, which is back here, forward of that sketch plane. If for some reason I wanted to extrude behind that, I could simply click the reverse direction button, and you'll see now this is my sketch plane and it's extruding behind that. So you can swap between front and back given that. Just to the right of that is this little thing that says blind. If I click on that, you'll see that there's a lot of different options. These, the first four of these, or sorry, the next four of these, all have to do if you have another body somewhere in your drawing field. And so you could extrude up to like the corner or a vertex, up to a surface, an offset from the surface, or up to a body. These are all slightly different versions of the same thing, and it has to do with the end condition. Does it like wrap the other solid, or does it just go up until it touches a point? In this case, the only two options that you could really take advantage of are blind, which is what we did, which means you don't really care about anything else. You just want to extrude at a certain distance, or the mid-plane extrusion. So I'm just going to click mid-plane just for a second. You can see the difference. You'll see what the mid-plane does is it now puts my sketch plane in the middle, and it's extruding that distance in front of and behind that. So just to make that a little bit more clear, it's going to take whatever this value is under dimension, which right now is set to 22. It's going to divide that in half. So it's going to extrude 11 units in front of my sketch plane and 11 units behind, so that the total depth of my extrusion is 22. This can be helpful if you are trying to keep your origin kind of centered on the part you're making, and it can be really helpful from that perspective. In this case, we certainly don't need to do that, so I'm going to go back to the blind extrusion, and under dimension, I'm going to give this a value of 25. That's going to be the depth that I want to use. Again, it's going to assume millimeters because we're in millimeters, so you don't need to choose any other unit there. Underneath this, I'm just going to turn this on momentarily so you can see what it is. This is draft. This is great if you are making a mold and you need to have your object being able to be released from a mold or something like that. If you're injection molding or casting something. You can also use it as a method for drawing. So as I start to change this, you'll see that what it's doing is it is giving an angle from your sketch plane along that extrusion value. Right now this is set for 11 degrees. That's a lot of draft. If you were doing injection molding, I think you probably need about a half a degree or so. But you can actually see how that's changing your model and changing that extrusion. Draft outward, if you click that box, it will change it. So instead of going making the front path smaller, it's making that front path larger and keeping that same 19 degrees of extrusion that way. In this case, I don't want draft at all, so I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that. Below this, you have direction 2. If I would select that, this is going to allow me to now, using my sketch plane, I'm going to be able to extrude in front of and behind that sketch plane, but not necessarily uniformly. So I've come 25 in front, I could come 10 behind. Now the total distance is 35, but now my sketch plane isn't necessarily centered. So this is different from that mid-plane extrusion, which divides the total number by 2 and extrudes in front and back that same amount. Here we're actually going to change distances on either side. Just like with this, I can add draft here by turning that draft tool on. I could turn draft on the front, and you'll see what happens now. I have draft happening on both sides. So if I wanted a parting line in my object, my sketch plane could be my parting line, and I could have draft on either side of those. In this case, I don't want draft on either side of those, and I actually don't want to extrude in the back direction. So I'm going to uncheck that just so I have that 25 unit extrusion from the front. After you've changed everything you want to change here, you go ahead and hit the check mark, and that's going to say to SolidWorks that you're done selecting that. One quick note before we move on and call this exercise done, just about navigation in the drawing space of SolidWorks. So we haven't really used this, or I haven't at least talked about this. We've been clicking a lot with the left mouse button. The scroll wheel is very, very helpful in SolidWorks. So the scroll wheel is your zoom tool. So as I rotate that scroll wheel, it's going to zoom in or out of my object. One thing to note here, wherever your mouse is centered, so if I want to look at that point, if I center my mouse over that point and click the scroll wheel, it's going to center to that point. So it's going to make that point the center of my screen. And if I move my mouse down here and scroll out, it's always going to make this part the center of the screen. So that's a really quick way to navigate using the scroll wheel. If you hold down your scroll wheel, so you click and hold your scroll wheel, this turns on the orbit tool. So this allows you, depending on how you rotate your mouse, it allows you to sort of orbit that object around in free space. So this can be really helpful to kind of like, what's on the back or what's underneath this? What does this thing look like from different directions? You can orbit using that direction. One other thing that's really helpful, if you hold down the control key and the scroll wheel, click and hold the scroll wheel, this is now pan. So it's not like, it's just moving what you're looking at. So instead of having to zoom into this point and keep zooming into this point, if I now wanted to look below this, but at the same zoom factor, hold down control, hold down the scroll wheel, and then I can sort of pan up and look around at the whole object to kind of zoom in and see what I'm doing. So once we have that, that's our navigation in SolidWorks. And that completes our first exercise in SolidWorks. Hopefully you found that helpful and enlightening. I would encourage you to continue working through the next couple of tutorials and learn more about what this amazing program can do. Thanks for tuning in.